A few weeks ago, I participated in Kenan's alternative spring break, where a group of 6 students traveled to the Rio Grande Valley region to see the U.S. Mexico border fence up close and personal. Born and raised in Miami, Florida, I had spent my entire life living within a diverse immigrant community, the majority of them Caribbean and South and Central American. I saw firsthand how incredible and vibrant immigrant communities could be. These were hardworking people with families and a desire for a higher quality of life. The place I grew up would not have existed without this community. The United States as it is today would not exist if not for immigrants. And thus, I never understood the rhetoric that sought to connote the word immigrant as something negative, as something criminal. As a political science student at Duke, immigration and the policies surrounding it are topics I have become increasingly interested in. In my classes, I read stories about the experiences of immigrants from all over the world. Some of these stories of triumph, others rather horrific, but I realized that there was only so much I could learn within the walls of a classroom. I knew that seeing the border up close, interacting with the people who lived in the area, would be the only real way to truly understand what the reality of what this big bad border was all about. I wanted to get out of the bubble and make what I was learning tangible. And after a week in the Rio Grande Valley, I found that many of my preconceptions were confirmed, but many more were altered or debunked entirely. Speaking to the residents of Brownsville, the majority of them Mexican with family who have either crossed or still reside there, I gained extremely valuable insight into what life is like living in a community that embodies the meeting and merging of two nations. The border, despite its barbed wire and the uniformed men with guns, seemed almost nonsensical in a place that was so fundamentally tied to the other side. Of course, the border implies more than just the wall, and that is where it becomes extremely important to understand how policies and enforcement are affecting the lives of real human beings. I left the Rio Grande Valley with many more questions than answers. So much about it is straightforward, yet so much else is nuanced and convoluted. But realizing that is something I take value in because I now have been pushed out of my bubble of complacency, and I know I have plenty of learning and plenty of searching ahead of me.
When I initially thought of the border, I thought of this impenetrable militarized force that regulated who left and who came and kept some kind of record of the migration between the U.S. and Mexico. But in reality, the border is full of gaps, and the ports of entry aren't even that militarized. In order to leave the U.S. and enter Mexico, you need to insert 4 quarters into a slot and turn a bar. That's it. No line, no fuss, just cross. To enter the U.S., you need to stand in a line that undoubtedly gets longer as the seasons pass and the sun gets hotter, walk through an 8-foot-tall metal gate, and present documents to an officer who makes you nervous, even though he really isn't doing anything out of the ordinary. It isn't difficult to read into these policies and extrapolate what we as a country believe about immigration. The fact that we make it so difficult to enter and don't place emphasis on those who leave shows that we are imbalanced and don't necessarily care about who exits the country as long as those who enter are doing so legally. When I think of the border now, I am reminded of how incredibly flawed the U.S.'s approach to border security and immigration is. Participating in Kenan's alternative spring break program with several of my peers has shown me that we are nowhere close to where we should be on border reform, and I hope to see change in the coming years. I am grateful for the opportunity to study the border in Brownsville and speak to those who are so much closer to life on the border than I am. I can safely say that I left Brownsville with many of my questions answered, but I can't say I left with all of them answered. The border is a fluid, constantly changing entity that I don't think anyone really understands, and though I realize that many want and believe it to be that impenetrable force stopping migrants from crossing, I don't believe it'll ever fully live up to its standard.
When I applied for the spring break trip, I had an abstract understanding of illegal immigration. I knew that Central and South Americans leave their home countries to come to the U.S. for a better life. I knew that the asylum and visa application processes are overwhelmed and not always accessible to migrants. I was following Congress's decision about whether or not to include DACA in the spending bill, but that was about it. there were all of these unanswered questions, like how do people cross the border? What's that experience like? What happens if they're intercepted by the Border Patrol? Where do they go after? Over the course of the trip, I gained a much more concrete and grounded understanding of illegal immigration, and I got that perspective from talking with people who have firsthand experience, specifically the Customs and Border Patrol agents in McAllen, Texas. The agents drove us through the border fence to the area where they patrol. That area is between the border fence and the river, and it looks the same as the rest of South Texas. Only these agents know this land like the back of their hand. At one point, they pulled over, and we walked to a spot where we could see the river. One of the agents described how migrants will get on a raft to float across the river. Then they'll crawl up the banks and walk toward the town. We also saw a group of migrants who were intercepted by the Border Patrol. When we arrived on the scene, they walked up to the truck. There were men, women, and children wearing multiple layers of clothing and carrying a few bags of groceries. The agent said that the migrants were expecting to run into them because the coyotes instruct them to turn themselves over if they're intercepted. The agents got out of the truck, asked the migrants some questions, and collected their belongings. It was strange to witness the migrants being intercepted because I couldn't imagine who they were or what they had been through to get to this point. The process was totally tame, more bureaucratic than dramatic. We also visited the facility where the migrants are held after they are intercepted by Border Patrol agents. The agents described how they process migrants and showed us one of the migrants' case files. All of these experiences showed me what illegal immigration actually looks like, how normal and human it is. Granted, crossing the river and being intercepted is one small moment in illegal immigrants' journeys. We didn't see where they were before they got to the border or where they would go after they left the CBP detention facility. However, knowing more about this moment helps me contextualize all of those other experiences.
For me, the most striking and thought-provoking encounter we had was when we met with Border Control agents at McAllen Station, and they took us on a tour of their facilities and a tour of their patrol route. So, Border Control's description of the issue categorized migrants as either impactables or non-impactables. Impactables being criminals like drug smugglers, and non-impactables being individuals or families seeking to cross for work, for asylum, or to reconnect with loved ones already living in the States. And they also described to us that cartels operate more or less as a business, and those wanting to cross into America have few options but to pay the cartels very high fees in order to cross. And more often than not, cartels will send non-impactables across the border, oftentimes families, to serve as a distraction for Border Control, and they will simultaneously be smuggling drugs across in strategic locations. And so from this, it seemed to me like a never-ending game of chess between cartels and Border Control. And more often than not, migrant families were being treated as unwitting pawns caught in the middle of this game. And from our conversations, I learned that stricter entry laws serve to do three things. They force individuals to cross in unsafe ways. They help the drug cartels monopolize on crossings. And they occupy the time and resources of Border Control agents on migrants who pose no threat to national security. And all of this simply leads to more lives lost and undermines the security of the border itself. And this idea that stricter requirements for legal entry could somehow undermine the security of the border is extremely counterintuitive and something that was alluded to by several of the agents on our tour. But when we talk about border security and immigration, I think it's important to remember the lives lost of people trying to cross unsafely, and that 1 in 4 people crossing are minors under the age of 18. It's important to recognize that families and children are attempting to cross to find jobs, to seek asylum, to reconnect with family, but cannot do so legally because the process is either too long, too arduous, or simply impossible. I think it requires some critical thinking and the ability to see the situation with more nuance than is traditionally stated by the media. And I hope this experience will help me to educate others and explain from my perspectives the issues that I learned about from this trip.
So something that I took away from this trip is that immigration is not some foreign concept, and that in order to understand it, it's really valuable to get proximate to the issue. We all hear about it on the news. We all discuss it with our peers, but we don't truly understand immigration or the immigrant's story. We don't think about the real people who are affected by border politics and immigration. But perhaps the most striking thing to me from this trip is that adults are not the only ones affected by current immigration policy, but children as well. So, meeting with the Border Patrol agents, we learned the term UACs, unaccompanied children. Children come across the border so frequently alone that they have a term, they have an acronym. And this really came full circle to me when we saw children in prison cells at the detention center. Prison cells whose doors have carved into them the initials of various cartels, and that we were not allowed to enter due to previous inhabitants' infectious disease conditions. So what do we do with these children, or where do they go? Their educations are interrupted, their future is uncertain, and they have to go through the complicated American judicial system alone. Well, one of the most hopeful moments of the program was when we met with Gabby, an educator who works with a humanitarian organization, the Southwest Keys Program, which runs immigrant children's shelters across several of the Southwest states. Children who come to the United States often have a rudimentary understanding of English, if that. They come sometimes with families, sometimes alone, sometimes fleeing violence or poverty, other times victims of human trafficking. And so what the Southwest Keys program does is try to make available some resources for these children who would otherwise be left to fend for themselves on the border or in the United States or back in their home countries. And that was really one of the biggest takeaways for me. Southwest Keys program is fabulous. It does a lot for children. But we do need to think more about policy moving forward, especially with regards to people who really can't defend themselves. Innocent children who are victims of circumstance in a lot of ways.
We didn't go one day of our trip without being reminded of the interconnectedness that exists between the sister cities of Brownsville and Matamoros. A few of the people we met noted that they frequented Matamoros for a variety of reasons, such as to procure medicine at a discounted rate, to receive dental care, or for entertainment purposes such as to grab a drink. Many of the people in Brownsville that we talked to remarked that they had family members on the opposite side of the border, and they traveled frequently back and forth to visit their family. Some also noted that the frequency of such visits decreased, resulting from a rise in cartel activity in Matamoros. We also heard of the Charro Days Fiesta, a festival that takes place annually in Brownsville and celebrates the rich Mexican culture in the city. It was surprising for us to learn that in years past during the celebration, the international bridge between the two cities was open and residents from either side could cross the bridge freely to celebrate in the festivities. We also learned that the local economies of the two cities were interconnected, in addition to the cultures. The proximity of the two cities and the interconnectedness of this relationship was made more tangible to us once we walked across the border bridge and into Matamoros.